To help launch his Voice campaign today, the Prime Minister enlisted the help of the Premier of South Australia, Peter Malinauskas, whose state already has legislated a voice to Parliament. Now, South Australia is a key state. The latest polls show that the state is split down the middle when it comes to the voice, with 43% voting yes to 39% voting no and 18% still undecided. So how confident is the Premier that his people will vote yes? Peter Malinauskas joins me now. Peter, as I said before, you have legislated a voice to Parliament that will be elected next year. Some of the early polling out of South Australia, which looks like it will be the state that may well decide this referendum on the double majority, was showing something like 60% support for the voice to Parliament. That has reduced quite significantly since you legislated a voice in South Australia. Do you think it's had a negative effect at all?
No, I don't, Caleb. I think what we've seen in South Australia has been pretty consistent with what we've seen around the rest of the country, that there has been a softening in some of the poll numbers for the yes vote. But we retain, a high degree of optimism here in South Australia, as I do in respect to the national picture, about the prospects of the yes campaign success. I think there's a lot of people, Caleb, who are, quite frankly, still disengaged on this issue more broadly. A lot of people have a lot of challenges in their own lives, tackling the cost of living crisis being a good example of that. And as we get closer to the referendum date itself, I think people will start to tune in and consider the actual question we've got before us. And I think once that happens, there's a chance that the yes campaign will start to see a climb in support close to the levels we saw earlier this year.
Well, you made comments today in The Australian to our colleague David Penberthy about the fact that if the Yes campaign wants to win this, they need to forget more about people being beaten over the head by corporates and told how to think, and we need a grassroots, on the ground kind approach to undecided voters. But when you've got people like your colleague in Canberra, Linda Burney, talking about things like Trump politics and slagging off Peter Dutton, that's the kind of thing that will be turning people off, isn't it?
Well, I think Linda is a great Australian. She's an extraordinary leader, and I give her nothing but total credit for her leadership for her people over so many years. I think different politicians have different styles, Caleb, but my firm view, and I think most people would share this view, is that you rarely persuade someone by, talking down to them or assuming that they approach an issue with ill intent. I know some really good people who look like at the moment they might vote no. I don't think that makes them a racist. That's just a genuinely held view that I have. But I'm going to seek to persuade them otherwise. I want to, in terms of the way they intend to vote. And I think, like I said, when you actually distill this down and remove lots of the noise around the place, and there is a fair bit, I think, regardless of which side of the campaign you're on, and just look at the question here about whether or not we're going to accept the recommendation from Aboriginal people themselves that they have an advisory committee. I mean, it is an advisory committee. I think once Australians understand that, they'll be inclined to think, well, that's fair enough. Aboriginal people should have an advisory committee, particularly if it's going to get us away from the status quo we've got in the country at the moment, which I think most people see as unsatisfactory, and I'm certainly in that category.
But I think the biggest problem the Yes campaign has is the lack of detail. How do you get over the lack of detail without actually telling people what it's going to look like? We know that's stuff that's not going to be given to people before we go to the referendum. Well,
because there's a lot of detail that we do definitively know, Caleb, and I think that's where the focus has got to be. And one of those key details, of course, is that the voice is going to be nothing more than an advisory committee to the Parliament. Now, I don't say that to diminish the advisory committee. I think it can be useful and powerful. As a policymaker myself, I can think of countless occasions where, by interacting in a thoughtful way with the very people that will be impacted by a decision I make, results in it being a better one. I think that's true for Aboriginal people on laws that affect them, and that's why they seek a voice to the Parliament. And I think we've got to focus on what this question is and what we're deciding on, rather than speculating about things that we're not deciding on in this referendum. I think that the Parliament should retain its primacy. It should retain its ability to determine the nation's future more broadly. But the Parliament should also have the opportunity to hear from Aboriginal people themselves on matters that affect them in an advisory context, because that's all this is. And I just retain hope and and a sense of optimism that when Australians contemplate that question, in isolation of all the other noise that's been created out there, that they'll be inclined to say yes. But of course, that's not up to me or any other politician. It'll be up to Australian people themselves. I just advocate that people championing the yes cause, and I count myself as one of them, engage with all people who have got different perspectives on this issue in a civil way. I mean, Caleb, I know a lot of people that are inclined to vote no who I think do genuinely care about the interests of Aboriginal people.
Indeed.
So I think
I'm sorry, Peter,
we've
we've run out of time, but thank you for being a Labor Premier who'll come on Sky News.